Welcome to another episode of the Practical SQL Server HA show. My name is Edwin Sarmiento, and welcome to the show. If you're seeing this for the very first time, welcome. Or if you've been watching these episodes for quite some time, thank you. The purpose of these episodes and these shows is to share insights, lessons, best practices, recommendations, sometimes blunders, mistakes, errors that me, in the early days of my career, implementing always on availability groups, high availability and disaster recovery solutions, and those of my customers that you can implement your high availability and disaster recovery solutions not just successfully, but in a more pragmatic and more practical way. I kind of look at it as, well, if I'm going to be spending for this, I want to make sure that I don't spend too much on it, but also making sure that it does meet my recovery objectives as far as my application is concerned, not just my database. The topic of this week's conversation: upgrade and migration considerations for SQL Server high availability solutions. This builds on a topic that I talked about a couple of weeks ago. On the topic was all about deployment projects failing, and I did share a little bit of a statistic and the trend of how customers are slowly moving into later versions of SQL Server as a side effect of either decommissioning unsupported versions of SQL Server or just making sure that they're keeping their infrastructures modernized, meaning, well, they're updated, they're installing the latest and the greatest versions. Not necessarily sometimes the greatest, like for instance, SQL Server 2025 is still, is somewhere in the calendar when it will be officially released. But idea behind that, again, is for customers to slowly move away from unsupported versions to newer versions, whatever that new version may look like for them as far as their application support is concerned, as far as what they internally would support, and of course also trying to minimize the risk of having new versions installed in production environment. I'm going to talk about this again from the point of view of upgrading and migrating not just normal SQL Server databases, but databases that are already in a high availability setup. Okay, and the way I look at this when it comes to upgrade and migration project timeline is you got the beginning and the end, meaning you have a current production environment. It's currently BAU, business as usual, and then you're getting started with an upgrade and migration project. Okay, so you have these sections in the entire project timeline where you are going to be doing kind of like a pre-upgrade or pre-migration section. You're preparing what you need to prepare. You are doing testing and you're doing validation. When you're happy with the plan to move forward, you then move into the actual upgrade and migration. Okay, this is where, of course, part of that, because you have an high availability solution, you have to think about how short this section is, or this portion of the project is, because your goal is to still maintain high availability while you're doing an upgrade and a migration. And then you have the post-upgrade or post-migration phase where you're stabilizing. You've already cut over to production, but you're still in the process of stabilizing the environment, meaning slowly inching into the old business as usual setup. Okay, so running your typical jobs, running the administration and maintenance jobs, making sure that they still run, and eventually stabilization phase. Now, notice that I've sectioned phase number 1, the pre-upgrade and migration, a little bit bigger than the rest of the phases. Why is that? Because there's a lot of risks involved when you are working with an existing high availability solution. Okay, there's a reason why you put your databases, your applications in a high availability setup. And so even when you're looking at migrating or upgrading the existing high availability solution, you have to make sure that you're still meeting the requirements for and the reasons why you have those high availability solutions in the first place. So the preparation phase would take up so much of your time. In fact, when I work with customers, this is the portion where we are gathering as much information as we can. We are building a parallel environment, meaning we're not touching production. We are building the new environment. We are replicating whatever configuration setting that we have from the old production to the new production, testing so many things until eventually we're ready to cut over, which is phase number 2. But again, the pre-upgrade and pre-migration phase is what we spend most of in my case, it's what I spend most of my time on, because I want to make sure that the actual upgrade and migration, phase number 2, and phase number 3 should be as short, as fast as possible. Okay, there are main challenges, some of the main challenges that you might encounter when you are doing database migration and upgrade. I want you to start taking notes. These are the things that you have to consider. And I did this presentation a couple of years ago for a large data professional conference. And what's really interesting is I've been doing upgrades and migration projects for more than 20 years now. And I see patterns and I see repetitive challenges. And that's why I compiled these challenges and grouped them into 4 sections. Okay? Grab your pen and paper, make sure you're taking notes. Here's the first one. The first one is destination. Okay? One of the biggest challenges when you're migrating your old high availability solution to a new high availability solution is your destination. Now, you might be thinking, what destination are we looking at here? One example of here is, are you moving from to a physical environment or a virtual one? Say, for example, you're coming from a physical environment. One of my customers, they were still running on SQL Server 2012 on a Dell, if I'm not mistaken, it's a Dell server, and they're moving away from the physical implementation to a virtual environment on VMware. So that's one thing that you have to think about. Where am I going to land into? Where am I coming from, and where am I going to land into? Particularly your databases. Okay, are you coming from physical, still moving to physical, or are you coming from physical and moving to virtual? Okay. Statistically, there are 81% of server workloads running in virtualized environments. Okay, and more are being moved to virtualized environments, mainly because, again, consolidation, lower cost of ownership, maintenance, hardware. They're trying to reduce capital expenditures as much as they can. Businesses, that is. You're saving on electricity, you're saving on hardware costs, on co-location, on data center utilization, air conditioning, all of these things. They're trying to reduce the cost. And so consolidating from physical to virtual has been going on. That's one of the reasons why VMware has become the standard when it comes to virtualized environments. This is something that you have to think about. And of course, this is a business decision. Am I going to virtualize my physical database, rather my existing physical database implementations, or do I want to keep them in physical machines because I want to make sure that I take full advantage of my database servers, right? Because of the IOPS and the throughput requirements, you want to dedicate hardware just for your database servers. Okay, your destination could either be on premises or the cloud. Okay, and of course, part of that question, which leads to, if you are coming from an old environment, where do you want to land onto? Do you want to land on physical machines, or do you want to land on virtual machines? If you decide you want to land on virtual machines, you also need to ask the question, do I want to host them on premises, meaning building your own private cloud, or do I want to move to public cloud implementation. So again, that's a business decision. However, this is one thing that a lot of businesses end up doing. They get lured into the promise of the cloud. It's going to be cheaper. No capital expenditures, only operational expenditures. Sure, in the beginning, but your cloud costs will skyrocket the more you use the cloud. Because next thing you know, initially you might want to put some portions of your workload in the cloud, public cloud that is. Then all of a sudden, now you're moving all of your workloads, and it's human nature. It's easier now that everything's on a public cloud, not realizing what used to be your capital expenditure, meaning from the point of view of finance, now becomes your operational expenditure. So watch those credit card bills. Just saying. So that's also another question that you have to ask is, where do you want to land? Do you want to land on premises, building your own private cloud, or do you want to land on either AWS or Azure, GCP, on any of the public cloud providers? Okay. Next is content, or C. Okay. What content are we looking at here? We're looking at not just the database, but anything that surrounds the database. Okay. For most of the time when we look at migration and upgrade, we're looking at, we're just migrate the database. That's the content that we're looking at. The way I look at it, anything that involves running your database, that includes your SQL Server instance and or the Windows Server operating system. Okay, I've been in so many customer environments where, because of the timelines of the release of these two different products, they're on a later version of Windows, so say Windows Server 2025, but still on SQL Server 2019. And so if they want to migrate or upgrade SQL Server to a later version, that's fine because they're already on later version of Windows. What's challenging is when they're on both older versions of Windows and SQL Server, like Windows Server 2016 and SQL Server 2014. Again, keeping in mind that hopefully you're no longer in an unsupported version of both SQL Server and Windows. That's the bigger challenge here. Because keep in mind, because these are two different products coming from two different product teams, they have different end-of-life dates. I'll give you an example here for Windows Server 2019 mainstream support. That's over. That's over more than a year ago. Okay. For SQL Server 2019 mainstream support, it's also over, but then you still have extended support. The idea here is to make that decision as to, do you want to move, or do you, of course, part of that is moving the databases. Are you going to upgrade SQL Server only, or are you going to upgrade SQL Server and Windows at the same time? I try to convince my customers to do it at the same time, other than the fact that we're saving on time and effort. Okay, some consultants would say, no, have it separately so that I can bill more billable hours. I don't like that. I don't like working for the sake of working. I want to make sure that we are doing meaningful work and work that is productive. And so I help my customers time which version of Windows and SQL Server they can use as part of the upgrade and the migration strategy. The only challenge there, of course, is when the application vendor then decides we cannot support X version of a SQL Server and or Windows, which is kind of surprising. And I don't really blame them, because there's so many things that they have to do as part of the upgrade. They have to test version compatibility. They would have to test feature compatibility of the app with the version. I remember at some point when SQL Server 2014 was introduced and the new query optimizer did not match what the application is capable of. And so when customers upgraded to SQL Server 2014, all of a sudden things were like slow, that you had to tweak the database engine to some old compatibility level until the application was modified to take advantage of the new query optimizer version. But again, it's part of the thing that you have to consider, because you're striking the balance between, do I move everything and do I upgrade everything? Meaning both SQL Server and Windows. And it's challenging, especially in organizations where you have segregation of duties. You got your silos, SQL Server, DBA team's taking care of that. Windows, sysadmin team taking care of that. Oh, by the way, the hardware, it's the hardware team, the server team's taking care of that. So now you have to coordinate which version of which platform and whichever has to be done, and which version of both Windows and SQL Server do you need to land on. What makes things complicated is when you start including hardware refreshes as well. Again, I've seen so many cases of customers in the past where they can't really move beyond certain versions of Windows and SQL Server because they're locked in on their existing either contract with the hardware vendor, and the next refresh would not be until like next year. So they're waiting for that. That's also one of the reasons why virtualization is becoming like this is the way to go thing. It's been like that for a couple of years, but customers are constantly re-evaluating hardware refreshes, which makes it more challenging to plan for upgrades and migration. So keep that in mind. When it comes to content, you're not just looking at databases, you're looking at version of SQL Server, version of Windows, and or hardware refreshes as well. Next is identification, or I. What I mean by identification is this. From the point of view of the application, will they still recognize my database? Okay? Will they still be able to identify the database? Okay? And this is more than just knowing where the database is after the migration and the upgrade. Okay? Part of that is also login, security, but in the overall gist of it is, will my application still be able to recognize my database? Will it still be able to identify the database after the migration? And when you look at a simple diagram like this, where you have your application connecting to your database. So on the left is your source. That's the old production environment. So client applications are connecting to that. By the time you move to a newer version, which is your new destination, that could be a new host machine, new server machine, new IP addresses, new everything. Will your client application still be able to connect to that? That's the question. Okay? Without making modifications to the application. We want to introduce minimal change, minimal disruption to the business, particularly the application, because again, this is a critical change, especially if the connection string is hard-coded in the application. We want to minimize that as much as you possibly can. That's why you have to ask yourself the question, will the application still identify the database after the migration? There are a couple of strategies that you can use to do that, but again, it all depends on how the application is configured as far as database connectivity is concerned, like the connection string parameters. Okay, so again, making sure that the application can still recognize, can still identify the database after the migration. Identification goes beyond just knowing that the application can still recognize the database, identify the database, and be able to connect to the database after the cutover from the old production to the new production. It involves compatibility. I did mention when SQL 2014 was introduced with the new cardinality estimator and the query optimizer, a lot of applications all of a sudden could not function properly, because they were not thinking about this new cardinality estimator, this new query optimizer engine, and they just, took it as it is. Part of the upgrade and migration strategy with your databases is testing whether or not your applications can still connect to the database, right? And also be able to function the way, Think of it as business as usual, minimal to no disruption to the application. Okay, and that's also one of the reasons why when you go back to the upgrade and migration project timeline, I spent so much time on phase one, pre-migration and pre-upgrade activities for phase one, because you want to test your application. So you got your application, again, we're assuming we're not even touching the application. You reconnect your application to the database, you test, you do functionality testing, smoke testing, connectivity testing, everything that you can do, as much as you can test, and observe the behavior, because if the behavior is not the same, even though you successfully migrated your databases to a new version, your application might not function the way it used to function. You got to catch that even before you do phase two, which is the actual migration. Okay, so it's more than just identification. Will my application still recognize my database? But also identification. Will my application still work? Is it compatible? Okay, are my queries, or whatever the queries were, whether they were done using an ORM tool, will they still work in the new version? You also want to keep track of some breaking changes that may impact your application. Okay, A is for availability. So we talked about destination. Okay, we've talked about destination. We've talked about the content. Okay, we've talked about identification. What about availability? Well, for one, your databases are in a high availability solution. They're in a high availability infrastructure for a reason. Okay, you want to keep those reasons. Okay, what are those reasons? Well, your recovery point and recovery time objectives are defined. There's a reason why you have existing high availability solutions, so you have to make sure that you're still keeping those. In fact, the last thing you want is introduce massive disruption, even though you request for a maintenance window. Okay. In fact, your maintenance window should not be beyond your acceptable recovery point and recovery time objectives, unless, of course, you're setting the expectation for your customers on the acceptable downtime. But again, when we're looking at large-scale implementations of high availability solutions, there's a reason why you have that. Typically, your recovery point and recovery time objectives and SLAs are very tight. It's also why in the operation and upgrade and migration project timeline, I spend a lot of time on phase number one, which is the preparation phase, because I want to make sure that I measure the amount of time it takes for me to cut over from the old production to the new production. And by measuring, I can guarantee that it meets my recovery point objective, recovery time objectives, and service level agreements to a point where applications and users did not even or do not even know that something happened. Okay, that's the goal. So you already have a defined recovery point, recovery time objective, and SLA for your existing high availability solutions. The question that you need to ask yourself is, what is my availability before, meaning before cutting over to production? And of course, the before here should be BAU, business as usual. Okay, your availability should be BAU, not even touching production. Okay, you're replicating production, you're creating a new environment, so you're barely touching production. Even if you're replicating data from your old production to your new production, very minimal disruption to business operations, as if nothing's happening. Everything's transparent. Customers don't feel it. Applications don't feel it. So it's as if nothing. Okay. During is where you want to keep a tight SLA, making sure that you're not going beyond your already defined recovery point objective, recovery time objectives, and SLA. This is one of those things where in the past, when customers would say, I want to implement some form of a strategy to migrate or upgrade from existing environments to new environments. So say, for instance, in the old environment, they're running failover clustered instances, SQL Server 2012, failover clustered instance to SQL Server 2022, and what they wanted was an availability group solution for 2022. You can do a couple of different ways. Database mirroring, no, not database mirroring because you already have an AG, but it becomes a little bit challenging when, let's say, I want to build something like that example, database mirroring. I cannot combine database mirroring with availability group, but that's also one possible way to quickly do a cutover, because all I have to do is switch roles. But then a consideration, when you immediately cut over to production, you have a standalone instance that isn't in an availability group yet. So part of that is really considering the strategies that you would implement in the actual migration and upgrade process should not exceed what is already predefined recovery point, recovery time objectives, and service level agreement. Okay, and of course you may have done a couple of these things before, like backup, copy, restore. It's still a thing. I still do this, especially if I'm coming from a very I wouldn't want to say not as tight of a recovery point, recovery time objectives, and SLA. So backup, copy, restore. Okay, log shipping. The only challenge with log shipping is, of course, if you use the built-in log shipping capability, you have like X number of jobs multiplied by the number of databases times 3. You have a log backup job, log copy job, and log restore job. So if you're dealing with 100 databases, that's 300 jobs that I don't want to deal with. So I customize my way of doing log shipping. And then there's database mirroring. Of course, just because Microsoft says it's deprecated doesn't mean it's not supported. You can still use it as a strategy to a shortened amount of time for you to do a cutover between your old production and your new production. Again, the challenge there is, if you want to land on an always-on availability group, you cannot combine always-on availability group with database mirroring. You have to pick and choose. So there's, again, a strategy there is making sure that as you're doing the upgrade and migration, you're keeping as close as possible to your already existing recovery point, recovery time objectives, and SLA, while also having the high availability solution the minute that you cut over to production. That's a challenge, right? Or using storage-based replication if your underlying enterprise storage subsystem has that capability, or using third-party tools. But again, the strategy there is considering all of the things that we've already looked into. Destination, content, identification, and availability. And here's the reality though, it doesn't stop here, okay? We are waiting for SQL Server 2025 to come out. It's in CTP, or Community Technology Preview. So there will always be this notion of vNext. vNext for you might be SQL Server 2025, or vNext for you might be SQL Server 2022 if you don't want to jump into the latest and the greatest. It could be your Windows Server vNext for you would be Windows Server 2025. It's already available to the general public. It's in RTM, so that might be vNext for you. Okay. It doesn't stop here. Like I said, Microsoft already announced the release or made an announcement about SQL Server 2025. It's not in, it's not generally available yet, but it is coming. It is coming, and so this will always be a part of IT operations. It doesn't stop here. The reality is, and one of my mentors and friend from the Microsoft community once said, the minute that you put something in production is the moment that you plan for obsolescence. It's just the nature of everything. Okay, you buy a shirt, you plan for obsolescence. You buy a pair of shoes, nothing lasts forever. I can wish. But that's part of day-to-day. It's part of your IT operation. It doesn't stop on the day where you've cut over to production and upgraded everything to, even if it's the latest and the greatest. You will have to plan for the next one. It could be 5 years down the road, 8 years down the road. I've had customers who would take the risk of upgrading to the latest and the greatest so that they can maximize their, what I call, staying in period. Staying in period means we are going to maximize the amount of time that we can stay in this particular platform without upgrading and still be under Microsoft support. Okay, so they're taking that risk, but it also involves a lot of phase one activities, the pre-upgrade and pre-migration activities, so that they can stay there as long as they possibly can and keep it as it is for the next however long Microsoft decides to support that version of both Windows and SQL Server. Okay, and we need to prepare a path to get to our next destination. Like I said, this is going to be an ongoing thing. I talk about upgrade and migration every time a new SQL Server version is released. And it stays the same, meaning the process and the fundamentals remain the same. It's just the strategies will be different depending on what features are available for those specific versions. But again, it is going to be a part of your IT operations. Okay? So, how do I prepare for upgrade and migration? I plan. That's one of the reasons when I showcased the upgrade and migration project timeline, I spend so much time on the planning phase. Well, it's really not planning phase, but the pre-migration, pre-upgrade phase. This is where you put a lot of time on planning, looking at different alternatives, different options for doing the migration, looking at DCIA, the destination, content, identity, and availability, and making sure that it is fully tested before you cut over to production. Okay? Spending so much time in planning, making sure that everything's tested, and making sure that you're not introducing disruption to the business, even if you've requested for a maintenance window. Okay? Again, those four things: your destination, your content, your identification, and availability. Four things that you have to consider when you are upgrading and migrating your existing SQL Server high availability solutions, keeping in mind that because those are already in a high availability setup, you would have to keep your already defined RPO, RTO, and SLA. In fact, from my experience, it's even more critical because now customers have expectations, right? Before you have your databases or your application in general in production, it's kind of like, yeah, we're guessing. We want zero downtime and zero data loss, but the customers don't really care too much about this because we're operating within a certain business operation time. But then now that it is in production, now that customers have experienced working with the app, there's a certain level of expectation that is set as part of that. So now you have to keep it really tight. A predefined RPO, RTO, and SLA should be met even while you're doing the cutover to production with very minimal to no disruption to business operations, even if you requested for an approved maintenance window. That is the goal, right? That is about it for this week's episode of the Practical SQL Server HA show. And again, keeping in context where a lot of upgrades and migrations are happening, these are the things that you have to consider. You have to prepare for, specifically, especially if you're coming from an already existing high availability solution. You have to think about those things: destination, content, identification, and availability. Right? This wraps up this week's episode of the Practical SQL Server HADR show. Tune in again for our next episode, and if you need help on anything related to SQL Server high availability and disaster recovery, like you're in that stage where you're preparing for an upgrade because majority of your databases are no longer under mainstream support, you're struggling along the extended support and you don't want to be there long enough, so you're already preparing for migration upgrade, or you're thinking of what high availability solution you need for the destination, meaning the new production environment. What would that look like? and maybe your team isn't ready yet to do those, but time is of the essence and you need to get this up and running, reach out. Showing you a link to my calendar page. Head on to this URL. This will redirect you to my calendar page where you can pick and choose a time that works for you. Let's schedule what I call a strategy session where we will talk about what your current state is, evaluating your existing high availability solution, what your destination can look like, right? Depending on what your existing infrastructure is, what your destination can look like, and how we can plan so that you can get there and not potentially cause issues as you're moving, upgrading, and migrating to a new environment. Okay? Again, use that link on the screen, schedule a strategy session. I'm more than happy to help in any way I can. And like I said, that's about it for this week's episode of the Practical SQL Server HA show. Tune in again next week for another episode. And if you want me to cover like specific topics, feel free, comment, mention that in a comment. Every once in a while, I would look at some of the comments. Some people send me direct messages and, requests for specific topics. In fact, I do have a form. I can't remember where it is now, but I used to have a form where people would submit like the topics that they want me to cover for this. I probably should post the topic form so that you can submit the topics that you want me to cover in these episodes, right? And with that, enjoy the rest of your week. I'll see you again next time.